The forest of the Vosges Mountains in October 1944 was not a battlefield. It was a green and gray tomb designed by nature to swallow armies whole. The towering pines grew so thick that they blotted out the sun, leaving the forest floor in a perpetual twilight of mist and shadows. It was a place where the rain did not fall so much as it permeated everything, soaking through wool uniforms, rotting leather boots, and freezing the marrow of the men who huddled in foxholes filled with sludge. This was the border of France and Germany, a jagged spine of rock and timber that the German army had turned into a fortress. They knew every ravine, every ridge, and every killing zone. And into this meat grinder. The United States Army threw the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. They were the Nisei, second-generation Japanese Americans, men whose faces looked like the enemy in the Pacific, but whose hearts bled red, white, and blue. They were men whose families were locked away in internment camps back home, behind barbed wire in deserts like Manzanar and Rovere. Stripped of their rights by the very government these soldiers were fighting to defend. They were fighting two wars, one against the Nazis in front of them and one against the prejudice behind them. And the Germans up on those ridges knew exactly who they were fighting. They peered down from their fortified bunkers, looking through Zeiss optics at the misery below, and they laughed. To the Wehrmacht grenadiers entrenched on the high ground, the soldiers of the 442nd looked pathetic. They were small men, averaging 5 feet 4 inches in height, weighing barely 120 pounds, soaking wet. The German propaganda machine had told them that the Americans were a mongrel race, weak and disjointed. And here was the proof. These were not the towering Aryan supermen of Hitler's fever dreams. They were short, brown-skinned, and struggling to haul their equipment up slopes that were near vertical. The Germans held the steep hills, terrain so rugged that mules broke their legs trying to climb it. From their machine gun nests, the Germans had a god's eye view of the Nisei battalions. They called them little men. They mocked their stature. They believed that biology and race dictated the outcome of battles, and they were convinced that these small soldiers would crumble when the hammer fell. They did not know that inside those small frames burned a fury hotter than the barrel of a .50 caliber machine gun. They did not know that the motto of the unit was "Go for broke," a gambling term that meant putting everything on the line, holding nothing back, risking total destruction for total victory. But the Germans would learn. They would learn in the bloodiest way possible. The tactical situation in late October was a nightmare scenario that military academies use as examples of what not to do. The 1st Battalion of the 141st Infantry Regiment, a unit of white soldiers from Texas, had pushed too far and gotten cut off. They were the lost battalion, surrounded by 6,000 German troops, starving, running out of ammo, and being slowly dismantled by artillery and sniper fire. 2 other battalions had tried to break through to save them and had been chewed up and spat out. The command came down the line to the 442nd. Go get them. It was a suicide mission. Everyone knew it. The terrain forced the rescuers to attack uphill, straight into the teeth of prepared defenses. The Germans had pre-sighted their artillery on the approaches. They had machine gun nests interlocking across the slopes, creating walls of lead that nothing could survive. And to make matters worse, the Germans had decided to play games. They were comfortable. They were warm in their bunkers. They had plenty of ammunition. So they decided to toy with the desperate attackers below. They treated the war like a blood sport, and the Nisei were the game. It started with the insults shouted through the fog. Guttural German taunts echoing off the wet stones. They called out racial slurs, mocking the American citizenship of the Japanese Americans. But words were cheap in war. The The real psychological torture was the fake surrender. It was a tactic born of supreme arrogance and a total lack of honor. A German position would fall silent, a white flag, or a rag that looked like one, would flutter above a log bunker. A helmet would appear, a hand raised in submission. The exhausted Nisei soldiers, desperate for a reprieve, desperate to take prisoners rather than kill, would hold their fire. They would rise from the mud, lowering their rifles, stepping out from behind the cover of the tree trunks to accept the surrender. And then the flag would drop. The machine guns, the MG-42s, known as Hitler's zippers because their rate of fire was so fast it sounded like canvas ripping, would open up. It was not war. It was an execution. Men were cut in half before they could scream. The Germans would laugh as the survivors scrambled back into the dirt, listening to the screams of their dying friends. They did this because they did not respect the Nisei. They thought these small men were foolish, naive, and weak. They thought they could break their spirit with treachery. Private Barney F. Hajiro was 28 years old. He was 5 feet 8 inches tall, taller than many of his comrades, but still looked up to the ridgeline where the enemy giants waited. He was a quiet man from Hawaii, the son of immigrants who had worked themselves to the bone in the sugarcane fields of Maui. He had known hard labor his whole life. He had known the crushing weight of expectation and the sting of being treated like a second-class citizen in the land of his birth. But up here, in the freezing hell of the Vosges, something inside Barney shifted. He watched the bodies of his friends pile up. He watched the stretchers coming down the hill, blood dripping into the mud. He heard the stories of the fake surrenders, the mockery, the laughter of the enemy. He carried a Browning automatic rifle. The bar. It was a massive weapon for a solitary infantryman, nearly 20 pounds of steel and walnut, firing a .30-06 cartridge that could punch through a tree and the man hiding behind it. It was a squad support weapon, designed to be fired from a bipod. Prone, suppressing the enemy while riflemen maneuvered. It was not a weapon meant for sprinting. It was not a weapon meant for assault. But Barney Hajiro was done with the rule book. The abyss of the situation was absolute. The 442nd was bleeding out. Casualties were mounting at a catastrophic rate. Companies that started with 200 men were down to 30 or 40. They were literally dying to save the Texans of the lost battalion, yard by bloody yard. The German defenses on the hill they called the Suicide Hill were impregnable. It was a fortress of earth and logs, ringed with mines and interlocking fire zones. The conventional tactics were failing. You could not flank them because the terrain was impassable. You could not bomb them out because the fog was too thick for air support. You had to go up the middle. You had to walk into the fire, and the Germans knew it. They sat up there, smug and secure, waiting for the little men to try again. They waved their flags. They shouted their insults. They baited the trap. Barney Hajiro sat in a foxhole filled with freezing water, cleaning the gas piston of his bar. He wiped the mud from the slide. He checked the magazine spring. His face was a mask of stone, but his eyes were burning. He realized that the Germans were not afraid. They looked down and saw targets, not threats. They saw small men with American flags on their shoulders and assumed they were soft. Hajiro decided then and there that he would teach them a lesson in fear. He would show them that the size of the man did not matter, but the weight of his fire did. The heresy of Barney Hajiro was his rejection of survival. In infantry training, you are taught to value your life so that you can continue the fight. You use cover. You move in short rushes. You communicate. You coordinate. But Hajiro looked at the ridge and realized that caution was getting them killed. The Germans were using the Nisei's caution against them, Every time the Americans took cover, the Germans pinned them down with mortars. Every time they paused to assess, the Germans repositioned. The only way to break the deadlock, the only way to stop the mockery, was to do something so insane, so aggressive, that the German tactical manual had no answer for it. He prepared his weapon for a task it was never designed for. He stripped off his heavy gear, anything that would slow him down. He kept his ammunition belt. He kept the bar. He checked the selector switch. He did not set it to the slow rate of fire for accuracy. He set it to the fast rate. He was turning himself into a human tank, trading armor for speed, and strategy for pure, unadulterated violence. He looked at the steep slope, covered in slick pine needles and mud, a slope that required hands and knees to climb. He looked at the German bunkers, waiting like dragons in the mist. He wasn't going to climb. He was going to run. The weapon itself became his total focus. The M1918. A .2 Browning automatic rifle was a beast of a gun. It fired a round that hit like a sledgehammer when you pulled the trigger. The recoil slammed into your shoulder with bruising force. The muzzle climbed, fighting the shooter, trying to spray bullets into the sky. To control it while standing was difficult for a large man. To control it while running uphill was considered impossible. It required a physical strength that belied Hajiro's frame. It required a grip of iron and a core of steel. He practiced the motion in his mind, low to the ground, gun tucked tight against the hip, leaning into the recoil, using the weight of the gun as a counterbalance to his own momentum. He was inventing a new doctrine of warfare on the fly, a doctrine of one. He loaded a 20-round magazine. He tapped it to seat the cartridges. He loaded another into his belt, and another, and another. He was carrying enough lead to sink a boat. He felt the eyes of the other men on him. They were scared. They were exhausted. They had seen the fake surrenders in the butchery. They needed a spark. They needed someone to show them that the giants on the hill could bleed. Hajiro stood up. It was a small movement, but in the context of a battlefield, where standing meant death, it was a scream of defiance. The mist swirled around his legs. The air smelled of cordite and rotting pine. Up on the ridge, a German machine gunner probably saw him. Maybe he nudged his loader. Maybe they laughed. Look at the little man. Look at him, standing there like a statue. Is he lost? Is he surrendering? They did not fire immediately. Perhaps they wanted to see what he would do. Perhaps they were resetting their aim for the fake surrender game. But Hajiro did not wave a white cloth. He did not raise his hands. He raised the bar. The heresy was complete. He was not playing their game anymore. He was rewriting the rules. He racked the charging handle, the metallic clack echoing through the trees. He took a breath that tasted of cold fog and imminent death. And then Barney Hajiro began to run. He did not run away. He did not run to cover. He ran straight up the gut of the hill, straight toward the sound of the laughter, straight into the abyss. The time for being the victim was over. The time for the small man was gone. Now, there was only the hunter. The first few steps were the hardest because they were a rejection of sanity. Every instinct in the human brain screams at a man to get down when the air is filled with supersonic lead. To stand up and run toward the source of the fire is an act of rebellion against biology itself, a conscious decision to override millions of years of evolutionary survival programming that dictates flight over fight in the face of overwhelming odds. Private Barney Hajiro broke that biological law. He crested the lip of the foxhole, and his boots fought for purchase in the slicks. Blood-soaked mud of the Vosges floor. He was alone for the first few seconds. He was the only moving thing on the entire slope of Suicide Hill. Behind him, the rest of I Company was pinned down, faces pressed into the dirt, praying for the mortar barrage to lift. their worlds reduced to the few inches of mud directly in front of their eyes. They looked up and saw Hajiro. They did not see a hero. They saw a dead man walking. They watched him struggle against the gradient, his legs pumping like pistons. The massive Browning automatic rifle held across his chest like a battering ram. The weight of the gun was crushing. Nearly 20 pounds of milled steel and walnut, loaded with heavy brass ammunition, dragging his center of gravity forward, threatening to pitch him face first into the mire. But he used that weight. He let the gun pull him up the hill, leaning into the slope, his eyes locked on the slit of darkness in the timber bunker 80 yards above him. The Germans were so surprised they did not fire immediately. They were accustomed to Americans moving in cautious squads, using cover and concealment, coordinating with radios and hand signals. They had never seen a single man charge a fortified line in broad daylight, abandoning all doctrine in favor of pure, kinetic aggression for a heartbeat. The battlefield was suspended in disbelief, the only sound the ragged breathing of a man sprinting toward his own grave. Then the spell broke. The German machine gunners woke up. The MG-42 in the center bunker traversed, its barrel spitting a tongue of flame 3 feet long. The sound was a continuous tear. A buzz saw that chewed through the pine trees around Hajiro. Bark exploded in showers of splinters. Mud erupted in geysers near his feet. The air around him snapped with the passage of hundreds of bullets per second, the sonic cracks merging into a deafening roar. But Hajiro did not dive. He did not flinch. He did something that the German gunners could not comprehend. He fired back while running. He squeezed the trigger of the bar, and the heavy weapon bucked against his hip. He was not aiming with sights. Aiming was impossible at this speed. He was aiming with instinct, using the tracer rounds as a guide, walking the stream of fire onto the target like a water hose. The 30-06 rounds, heavy enough to kill an elk at 1,000 yards, smashed into the logs of the German bunker. They punched through the wood, sending deadly splinters flying inside the enclosed space. They shattered the sandbags, turning the enemy's cover into dust. The German gunner, safe behind his fortifications a moment ago, suddenly found his cover disintegrating around him. Hajiro kept coming. He was screaming, a primal roar that was lost in the cacophony of gunfire. But his face was a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He was 40 yards away, then 30. The German fire became erratic. The gunner was flinching, ducking the heavy American rounds that were hammering his position with the force of a jackhammer. Hajiro did not let up. He emptied the 20-round magazine in a glorious, terrifying burst, the bolt locking back with a metallic clank that signaled the end of the opening salvo. He did not stop moving to reload. This was the crucible of his own making, and momentum was the only thing keeping him alive. If he stopped, he died. If he slowed down, he died. His hands moved with a blur of practiced motion, dropping the empty magazine into the mud, snatching a fresh one from his web belt, and slamming it home with a force that bruised his palm. He racked the slide on the run, his thumb finding the release, and the weapon was live again. He was now 20 yards from the first nest. He could see the helmet of the German soldier popping up, trying to reacquire him, trying to bring the machine gun back to bear on the madman charging up the slope. Hajiro didn't give him the chance. He fired a burst that silenced the bunker forever. He reached the perimeter of the nest, vaulted over the shattered sandbags, and landed in the mud on the other side. He didn't check the bodies. He didn't pause for a breath. The smell of the bunker hit him cordite, unwashed bodies, and the copper tang of fresh blood. He turned and looked up the hill. There were more. The ridge was a honeycomb of death. 2 snipers on the left flank began to take shots at him, their rifles cracking dryly in the damp air. A second machine gun nest, higher up and to the right, swung its barrel toward him, He was in the middle of the kill zone, exposed from 3 sides. A singular target on a stage of destruction. But he had broken the line. He was inside their guard, the men of I Company. Seeing that Hajiro was still standing, seeing that the first dragon had been slain, began to rise. They saw the impossible happening, and they found their own courage in the madness of one man. A ripple of movement went through the pinned-down unit. They began to move up, shouting to one another, driven by the shame of letting one man fight their war. But they were far behind, for now. Hajiro was still alone in the fire. The ascent became a blur of violence and exhaustion. His lungs were burning as if he had swallowed hot coals, the oxygen starvation turning his vision gray at the edges. The cold mountain air tore at his throat, tasting of pine needles and sulfur. Every muscle in his legs screamed for relief, the lactic acid building up with every agonizing step. The slope was 45 degrees in places, slick with ice and rot, a terrain that would be difficult to hike in peacetime, let alone sprint up under fire. He slipped, his knees slamming into a hidden rock, tearing the fabric of his trousers and flaying the skin. But he scrambled up on all fours, using the stock of the bar as a climbing pick, driving it into the earth to haul himself upward. A sniper bullet whizzed past his ear, close enough to feel the heat of its passage. A supersonic wasp, angry for blood. It slapped into the mud inches from his face, spraying dirt into his eyes. He blinked it away, tears streaming down his grime-streaked face, and scanned the trees. There, a shadow in the mist, a gray shape perched in the crook of a high branch like a vulture. Hajiro swung the heavy rifle up. The bar was not a sniper rifle, it was a bludgeon, an area denial weapon. But at this range, volume mattered more than precision. He unleashed a long burst, sawing through the branch, shredding the leaves, and the man hiding behind them. The German sniper tumbled from the tree, hitting the ground with a wet thud, his rifle clattering away into the undergrowth. One down, but the second sniper was still out there, and the machine gun on the right was dialing him in. The ground around him churned, the dirt dancing under the impact of the impacts. He rolled to his left, finding momentary cover behind the stump of a blasted oak tree. He gasped for air, checking his ammo. He was burning through it fast. He had to make every shot count. But he couldn't stay here. The mortar teams would have this coordinate zeroed in seconds. To stay was to die. To move was to risk death. Hajiro chose the risk. He pushed off the stump and sprinted into the open again. This time, he ran diagonally, cutting across the slope in a zigzag pattern to throw off the aim of the second machine gun. The gunner was leading him, trying to predict his path, trailing a line of bullets just behind his heels. But Hajiro was moving like a man possessed, fueled by a cocktail of adrenaline and hatred. He wasn't running like a soldier following a manual. He was running like a linebacker, head down, shoulders hunched, driving through the resistance with brute force. He saw the muzzle flash of the second nest. It was dug into the side of a rocky outcrop, almost invisible except for the fire spitting from its mouth. This was the nest that had killed his friend the day before. This was the nest that had mocked them with racial slurs echoing through the fog. He saw the white rag fluttering on a stick near the aperture. The fake surrender flag. It was still there. A dirty, tattered symbol of their treachery. A stain on the honor of warfare. The sight of it injected fresh adrenaline into his veins, clearing the gray form his vision. It clarified everything. There would be no prisoners today. There would be no parley. There would only be the finality of the .30 caliber round. He stopped running. He planted his feet wide in the mud, digging his heels in for stability. He shouldered the rifle and stood like a statue in the storm, ignoring the bullets that hissed past him. The German gunner saw him stop. He thought he had him. He held the trigger down, the belt feeding smoothly into the receiver. The bullets kicked up a wall of dirt in front of Hajiro, creeping closer, walking up to his chest. Hajiro didn't flinch. He aimed directly at the flag. The duel lasted 3 seconds. It felt like an eternity. Hajiro fired. The heavy round smashed into the rock face, chipping away the granite cover, sending stone shards flying like shrapnel. He adjusted his aim, walking the fire into the aperture. The German gun stopped firing. Silence. Then, a scream. Not a scream of command, but a scream of agony. Hajiro didn't stop. He emptied the magazine into the hole, shredding the flag, shredding the gun, shredding the men behind it. He wanted to make sure they never waved a white flag again. He reloaded, his fingers numb and fumbling slightly with the latch. He was hit then. A sharp, stinging impact on his shoulder. A sniper's bullet had grazed him, tearing through the wool of his jacket and furrowing the skin, exposing the muscle beneath. It burned like a branding iron, but the pain was distant, separated from his consciousness by a wall of shock. He checked the wound briefly. Blood was dark against the olive-drab uniform, soaking into the fabric. It wasn't an artery. He could still move the arm, though the nerves were screaming in protest. That was all that mattered. He looked up. He was nearing the crest. The main line of resistance was just ahead. He could hear the shouts of German officers trying to organize a defense against the madman who refused to die. They were panicking. Their invincible fortress, built to withstand armies, was being dismantled by a single soldier who was too angry to be killed. The crest of Suicide Hill was a moonscape of craters and shattered timber. The artillery had pounded it for days, but the Germans had stayed deep underground, in bunkers reinforced with railroad ties. Now they were surfacing, swarming out of their dugouts like ants from a kicked hill to repel the assault. Hajiro reached the top. He was panting, his breath coming in ragged gasps that rattled in his chest. He was out of breath, but he was not out of ammo. He crested the ridge and found himself face to face with the 3rd machine gun nest. This one was facing the other way, firing down into the valley at the rest of the battalion, cutting off their advance. The crew didn't even see him coming. They were so focused on the easy kills below that they forgot to check their flank. Hajiro walked right up to them. He was 10 yards away. He shouted at them. Not a warning, a challenge, a release of the pressure building in his soul. The gunner spun around, eyes widening in shock beneath the rim of his helmet. He reached for his Luger pistol, fumbling with the holster. Hajiro cut him down before the pistol cleared leather. The loader tried to raise his hands, tried to play the game again, looking for mercy in the eyes of the man he had been trying to kill. Hajiro saw the movement. He saw the hesitation, but he also saw the stick grenade on the man's belt. He didn't hesitate. He fired. The 3rd nest went silent. The occupants slumped over their weapon. Now the Germans knew he was there. The element of surprise was gone. He was on the ridgeline, silhouetted against the gray sky, a perfect target. He became a magnet for every weapon in range. Bullets struck the ground around him, buzzing like angry hornets. He dove into the empty German machine gun pit he had just cleared, sliding into the gory mess of the previous occupants. He spun around, resting the bar on the lip of the trench. Now he had the high ground. Now he was the king of the hill. He saw a squad of German infantry rushing toward him, bayonets fixed on their Kar 98 rifles. They were trying to overrun him before he could reload, screaming their own war cries. He pulled a grenade from his vest, pulled the pin, and held it for 2 seconds. 1, 2. He lobbed it over the parapet. The explosion shook the ground, throwing dirt and debris into the air. The German charge faltered as men were thrown backward by the blast. Hajiro popped up and fired. Short, controlled bursts now. 1 man fell. 2. The rest scrambled for cover. Their morale shattered. He had stalled the counterattack. He looked down the hill. He saw the helmets of the 442nd bobbing in the mist. They were coming. They were shouting his name. Hajiro. Hajiro! It was a war chant, a sound that drove fear into the hearts of the enemy. But the battle wasn't over. The sniper who had grazed him was still active, moving through the rocks like a phantom. Hajiro spotted the flash from a cluster of boulders 50 yards along the ridge. He couldn't get a clear shot from the trench. He had to move. He climbed out of the safety of the pit. Ignoring the cover he had fought so hard to take, his arm was throbbing now. A deep, rhythmic ache that pulsed with his heartbeat, turning his left hand into a claw. He ignored it. He ran towards the rocks, firing from the hip to keep the sniper's head down. The sniper fired blindly, the shot going wild, striking a tree branch above Hajiro's head. Hajiro closed the distance. He reached the rocks. He didn't shoot. He used the butt of the heavy rifle, smashing it into the enemy position. A final, brutal act of close-quarters combat that ended the threat. The ridge fell silent. The wind howled through the shattered trees, carrying the scent of death and gunpowder. Hajiro stood alone on the summit of Suicide Hill. His uniform was torn, soaked in blood and mud. His barrel was smoking, the heat radiating in waves, turning the raindrops into steam. He looked down at his hands. They were shaking violently, not from fear, but from the adrenaline crash, the chemical withdrawal leaving him weak and trembling. He leaned against a charred tree trunk and slid down until he was sitting in the dirt. He took a cigarette from his pocket. It was crushed and wet, useless. He put it in his mouth anyway, needing the familiar sensation. The rest of the unit crested the hill moments later. They found him sitting there, surrounded by the ruin he had caused. 2 snipers, 3 machine gun nests, countless infantrymen scattered in the brush. The path up the hill was clear. The stranglehold was broken. The men of I Company looked at him with a mixture of awe and fear. They didn't say anything. There were no cheers, just the heavy breathing of survivors and the clinking of gear. They moved past him, securing the perimeter, checking the bunkers for survivors. They treated him like he was fragile, like he was a bomb that might go off again if handled roughly. A medic rushed over to check his shoulder. Hajiro waved him off initially, pointing down the reverse slope with his good arm. The lost battalion. They were still down there. The job wasn't done. The 442nd pushed forward, fueled by the momentum Hajiro had bought with his own blood. They broke through the final German defenses later that afternoon, when they reached the Texans. The white soldiers came out of their holes, gaunt, hollow-eyed, weeping. They looked at the Nisei soldiers, the men they had been told were inferior, the men they had looked down upon before the war. They hugged them. They shook their hands. They realized that the blood that had been spilled to save them was the same color as their own. The racial barriers that had existed days ago had been washed away by the blood of the 442nd. Barney Hajiro was evacuated to a field hospital. The adrenaline had worn off, and the pain was blinding. A white-hot fire in his shoulder and wrist. He had been shot 4 times in total during the campaign. His wrist was shattered, the nerves severed. His shoulder was a mess of torn flesh. He lay on a stretcher, staring up at the canvas roof of the medical tent, listening to the rain drumming against the fabric. He listened to the groans of the dying around him. He thought about the hill. He thought about the white flags. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt tired. Bone-deep tired. The Army awarded him the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions on Suicide Hill. It was the 2nd highest honor the nation could bestow. But back home, the newspapers barely mentioned it. The war ended. Hajiro went back to Hawaii. He went back to a quiet life. He didn't talk about the Vosges. He didn't talk about the bar or the running or the killing. He worked. He raised a family. He grew old. But his arm never fully healed. It remained weak, a constant reminder of the day he carried the weight of an entire regiment. The scars on his body faded to white lines, maps of a journey into hell that only he could read. But history has a way of correcting itself, even if it takes a lifetime. In the late 1990s, the United States government began a review of the service records of Asian American soldiers. They realized that prejudice had played a role in the awarding of medals. Many men who deserved the Medal of Honor had been downgraded to the Distinguished Service Cross simply because of their race. They looked at the files of the 442nd. They read the after-action reports. They read the witness statements of the men who had watched Barney Hajiro charge a mountain alone. The descriptions were consistent. A single man, a frontal assault, the destruction of an entire German defensive line. It was undeniable. In June 2000, 56 years after he ran up that hill. Barney Hajiro stood on the lawn of the White House. He was an old man now, frail, leaning on a cane, his hair white as snow. The President of the United States placed the Medal of Honor around his neck. The blue ribbon sat heavy against his suit, a weight of honor to match the weight of the rifle he had carried. The cameras clicked. The world finally saw him. Not as a Nisei soldier, not as a small man, but as a giant among men. The cost of that day, and the days surrounding it, was staggering. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team suffered over 800 casualties to save 211 men of the lost battalion. It was a statistical trade that no general would make on paper, but one that the soldiers made with their lives. They had proved their loyalty. They had proved their courage. But for men like Barney Hajiro, the medals were just metal. The real legacy was in the silence of the forest in the Vosges. If you go there today, the trees have grown back, covering the scars of the artillery. The bunkers are collapsed, covered in moss and ferns, but the ground is still scarred. You can still find rusted casings from a Browning automatic rifle, buried deep in the earth, marking the path of the man who refused to stop. The Germans on that hill had made a fatal calculation. They looked at the height of the enemy and forgot to measure the size of his heart. They mocked the small soldiers. And in return, they received a lesson in devastation that echoed through history. Barney Hajiro taught them that there is no such thing as a small soldier when he is fighting for his brothers. There are only targets, and the men who destroy them.